Hi, everyone. My name is Ranjit Nair, and I'm the president of Stanley Black & Decker's infrastructure business. I also serve as an executive sponsor of our Asian Heritage Network Employee Resource Group, a community that encourages culture, connection, and development by embracing our Asian heritage. I'm honored to be partnering with SASE, and I'm privileged to be part of this professional development webinar series hosted by Stanley Black & Decker. Diversity, equity, and inclusion is a cornerstone of our company and a personal passion of mine. Across our organization, we firmly believe together we are more and are committed to prioritizing DEI in everything we do, between holding DEI workshops, having meaningful conversations, and pursuing ambitious goals to further drive DEI. It's fantastic to see SASE's commitment to the advancement of scientists and engineers of Asian heritage, including this dynamic webinar series that encourages your professional growth and development. Our team is looking forward to furthering our relationship with SASE, including attending this year's Women's Leadership Conference and having members of our own Stanley Black & Decker team graduate from the Top Gun Leadership Academy. Thank you to the SASE team for your partnership, and on behalf of Stanley Black & Decker, we hope you enjoy today's session.
Good afternoon, folks. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm hoping you can see my slides right now. This is Parag Matawar. I am the Director of Professional Programs at SASE, at the Society of Asian Scientists and Engineers. I'm guessing that we may have some newbies in the audience, so shout out to all of you who have never been to one of these or didn't even know SASE existed until just now. So for those of you, I'm going to talk through a little bit about what we do. So the challenge that we are facing is that Asians are 50% less likely to get promoted to middle management versus our Caucasian counterparts. This makes a massive Asian leadership gap that impacts us individually, but also impacts the businesses that we're employed at. And so that's a lot of untapped potential, again, both personally, but then also for our organizations. And so what we have found is that there are 4 common reasons from research with executives, 4 common reasons that limit our population. And they are the lack of political and organizational savvy, cultural deference to authority, ineffective communication and influencing skills, and finally, an aversion to risk-taking. Now, all 4 of these may not speak to you personally, maybe some of them do, and because we're all different human beings at the end of the day, right? So the challenge with addressing these, as we see it, is that there's some barriers. One is even a lack of awareness of what I've shared with you so far. The second is, okay, the so what? How do I do something about it? We've found that, generally speaking, training those leadership skills with cultural context is incredibly important to provide that cultural agility to succeed in the workplace. And the reality is that Asian development is often a lower priority for companies and the resources. So what we do as a solution at SASE is we bring together now nearly 100 companies and utilize the power of scale to deliver programs like our national conference coming up in a few months, our women's conference a few months ago, and importantly, this webinar series that you are sitting in today. So that's where this came from. It's an ongoing free series, roughly monthly, featuring training partners or interviews with executives roughly every 4 weeks. The recordings are posted on our website for about 2 months or more. And you can stay informed by monitoring our website, but easiest is honestly just following us on LinkedIn. Chances are, if you got notification of this from your company, chances are your ERG leaders are tapped in and will be sharing this information moving forward. So with that, I'll stop talking. I want to bring up our speaker today, Simmer Singh. I was introduced to Simmer from one of our attendees. One of our attendees who loved our programs, knew Simmer, connected me with her, and she does some fantastic work, and I'm really pleased to bring her here. So, I mean, honestly, if any of you have a trainer in mind, a partner in mind, by all means, I'm happy to connect with them. Just, connect me with them at pro@saseconnect.org. But for now, Simmer has some fantastic information to share. So Simmer, I'm going to hand it over to you. You can I'll stop sharing and you can take it away.
Thank you so much, Parag. I'm going to quickly start sharing. Well, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining the session today. I'm going to quickly start with a little bit introduction on my consulting firm and myself, and then we'll dive into this research that we're going to talk about today from Center of Creative Leadership, one of my favorite vendors that I've worked with for a long time. A little bit about me, been in the leadership development, talent management space for over 2 decades. I've worked with organizations like VMware, Pinterest, Vodafone, American Express, Airtel. Always worked with large organizations doing the work around leadership development, talent management, running large projects. I call myself a jack of all trades. I don't know if that's a good thing, but I've done designing workshops. I've done work around coaching. I have a bunch of psychometric certifications. I've done a ton of work around performance reviews, which is such a loved and hated process. And then key talent assessment, succession planning, etc. Did that for a long time, and then, kind of approached a fork in the road kind of a decision where I thought, should I continue doing this, or do I want to let go of the golden handcuffs and start something of my own and offer my services from outside? So that's what I do. I run a firm called Glint Consulting, Glint with a double T. My firm focuses mainly on leadership development, team effectiveness, and diversity and equity. And the interesting thing about me is that I made a huge transition, which Parag and I will talk about 7-8 years ago from India to here. So the experience has been very, very interesting. But let's dive into the research. I do have a few slides, and then I would love to hear some thoughts, from you all, and we'll make it more interactive. So just, looking at this slide again, the research is from Center of Creative Leadership, and the slide really represents how Asia is going to be the center of the world. Asia is rapidly emerging as the new center of the world. Any organization that does not have a compelling Asia strategy, honestly, is really late to the party. When there is reference of global companies, people think Western organizations, but 1 in 3 of top 200 companies are Asian, mainly Chinese. Looking at the data, we'll start from the top left-hand side. If you can see, the profiltration of technology and internet in Asia has been really big. 50% of the internet users are Asian. 1 in 2, that means 1 in 2, is an Asian, and followed by Europe, and then you have LATAM, Africa, and North America. Then if you see on the right-hand side, top right-hand side, we're looking at some data about the sizable potential workforce being Asian too. So if you see 60% of the world's youth aged from 15 to 24, either lives in Asia or is of Asian descent. And then you have, which basically means that Asia may be the biggest exporter of workforce and talent to the entire world in a decade from now, really. And then what you see on the bottom left is really the annual percentage growth. So emerging and developing Asian countries have, a 6% per annum growth. This includes Asian countries, outside of the Asian 5, which is Indonesia, Malaysia, Philippines, Singapore, and Thailand. And then the rest of the countries, you see a growth of 5%. Again, a huge business case for Asia. And then on the right-hand side, bottom, what you see is really it says that Asia will be the biggest market in the future. Almost 9 out of 10 next billion entrants to the middle class will be Asians, and the continent will account for 2/3 of the global middle class population by 2030. So some interesting data there for us to think about, and hence, people like us, Asian leaders, are definitely of very, very critical importance. So let's see what are some inherent traits, that Asian leaders kind of bring to the table. And these are some quotes. You can take some time to read these. Some of the leaders, as they were interviewing, they shared why they felt these traits were critical. So there's definitely superior execution and a strong work ethic. Asians definitely demonstrate, very strong work ethic, mainly because they have a big willingness, a big drive to stretch and achieve goals. Sometimes I do feel like we're kind of, the work-life balance may suffer. Having said that, I feel like Asians in general are very passionate and they immerse, their heart in everything that they do. Then you see something on the left side, the two kind of traits that really stand out are empathy and humility, which are very kind of critical traits. They may manifest in different countries, but are extremely critical. Mainly, I feel like if we can talk about like it's attributed to our culture, our upbringing, some of the religious beliefs. And then there is, you see the VUCA-friendliness on the bottom right-hand side. The VUCA-friendliness really is a function of, a region with moving policies, stock markets. And I think in some ways, because there's so many changes that, the countries go through or people in general go through, the output of that is that we embrace diversity and things like that. And somebody, if you can see, the comment here says that Asians grew up in a disorganized economy, always dealing with problems minor to major. So we tend to be cool and calm. So our ability to deal with noise in general is much better. And I would love to hear some thoughts from the group later on what they think about, these traits, whether you've grown up in Asia or otherwise. Let's see, like, despite these inherent strengths that Asians bring to the table, we can look at a little bit of what does the representation of Asian leader population look like, in the Western companies. So what you see here is a data of the top 200 organizations. You see the number in a parenthesis, that's the number of companies. Despite compelling business case, you'll notice that the global Asian leader pipeline, tends to be, the data suggests that it's not that great. Not too many organizations bring in, Asian leaders. What they're talking about here is mainly executives of Indian origin. Asian representation in executive leadership teams of top 200 companies is in single digits, considering only 132 companies are not headquartered out of 200 in Asia. Leaders of Indian origin tend to dominate the small community of global Asian leaders on the top. The US headquartered companies account for 8% of the Asians in their executive leadership teams, almost half of the community comprising of leaders from Indian descent. The European companies tend to be much more conservative. You see, the data here says only 2%. Mainly, again, Indian leaders in the European companies. In fact, one of the leaders in the interviews also said that for Europe, they may still be in that colonization history phase, and it'll take them a long time to kind of bring in, whereas US on the other end is much more open to immigrants and things like that. So several leaders call this phenomenon a bamboo ceiling for Asian leaders. This plays out no differently in Asian companies. In non-Asians comprise about 2% of the leadership team in Asian companies as well. So that's a little bit about, the representation of Asian leaders. Let's look at now, what are some common leadership traits that Asian leaders have, and how do they tie the Asian leaders together? Any conversation about leadership, I think, has a big dialogue about culture, which is the biggest elephant in the room. Culture profoundly changes our perceptions. Therefore, it has a big influence on the leadership aspects that need to be evaluated closely to understand the context in which we operate. I'll talk a little bit more about the collectivist approach and a little bit about hierarchy, how we kind of deal with that. But really, there's a lot of, other things that you see here, right? The focus on harmony is a big one. Non-confrontational attitude, whether it comes to conflict or whether it comes to assertively kind of, making a business case or sharing feedback and things like that. What you see again, it also talks about different flavors. Usually people kind of bucket Asia as one kind of big chunk, but Asians, Asia in itself is so big and so diverse, right? Like the leaders in Asia in different regions have different traits and ethnicities, and they may look and behave very, very differently. And then there's the whole, VUCA-ready attitude. Individuals here operate in a much more VUCA environment, and then they may attach a very different value to various aspects of employment cycle, whether it's money, because things are so chaotic. I feel like we really appreciate, what we're able to, and we really fight for things that we truly believe we deserve. And then there's, of course, the whole networking and relationship building. Asians operate far more in a community way, even at work, and things like that. So that's really a little bit about the common leadership, traits that bind Asian together. Again, we can talk a little bit more about that when we have more conversations. I do want to deep dive a little bit quickly, show you some data around collectivist approach and power distance. So there's a gentleman by the name of Grief Hofstede who's done some research, and I believe these two, and his research is around like culture dimensions of leadership, I believe, and there are 6 traits. The 2 of them that we're talking about here are power distance. So power distance really is all about hierarchy, a culture that gives great deference to a person of authority, and respects authority a lot more, has high power distance. As you can see on this slide, interestingly, Asian countries are very high on power distance. And, again, we can talk about how much of that kind of how that plays out, in our corporate career and things like that. Malaysia, Philippines, China, Indonesia, Singapore, all of them have really high power distance, whereas you'll see US, Canada, Germany, UK, Australia, that they're low on power distance, which means that, the hierarchy is less kind of respected and people are treated more as equals. And then moving on to a little bit about individualism. Really what it is a preference of a looseliness societal framework in which individuals are expected to take care not only of themselves, but also of their immediate family. I think it's changing. I feel like even in Asian countries now, it's changing, than what it was many years ago, where there were a lot more joint families, they're becoming a lot more nuclear and things like that. But you will still see that a lot of, countries like Thailand, Singapore, South Korea, Indonesia still have a big collectivism culture, which means that they believe that, their immediate families are as important, and it's critical for them to take care of their immediate families. So that's really, a big part of the research. The last slide, I really want to quickly cover, and I think Parag may have talked, about it many times over. What are some skills or what are some attributes that will help us succeed, or Asian leaders succeed, in the global leadership or in the global leadership roles? So really, there are 5 critical attributes that Asian leaders must demonstrate to be successful in global roles. One is the courage. And when we talk about courage, it's really about, having tough dialogues, pushing back, leading difficult conversations, speaking up, when we don't agree. The whole, in India, we say the Indian nod, like you never know whether you're agreeing or not agreeing. And then, defending business cases and sharing your opinion, which is not popular or opposite to the rest of the group and things like that. The second is really curiosity, which is about learning new things. It could be new cultures, it could be new ways of doing things, and just being open-minded to things that we haven't tried in the past. The third piece is really around trust. So trusting people and being trustworthy to be able to build relationships, get work done, develop networks in a complex environment, being non-judgmental. I feel like some strengths that we do bring to the table is generally like forming relationships, but sometimes Asians may lean towards people who are more like them. So how do you build trust with people, in different cultures or in your teams and things like that? And then you have the ability to influence, which is very important, whether it's about influencing, critical decisions. It could be a compelling kind of business case, effective communication. It could be also influencing and managing the political landscape in an enterprise. It could be negotiating skills and things like that. And finally, strategic thinking, which is more about having that long-term view on business, understanding the micro and macro shifts, displaying the business acumen, and kind of trying to resolve conflict in a way that is conducive to the business. So these are the 5 critical traits. And I think interestingly, some of the leaders who have been interviewed as a part of the research, also said there's also something called as a must-have hygiene element, which means the aspiration of Asian leaders to step up in global roles. What they said was that being a global leader is a really tough job. It requires a lot of travel. It may mean midnight phone calls, it may mean rotations. There's a lot of like uncertainty. So you do get rewarded handsomely, but it takes a toll on the family life. And in some ways, kind of having that willingness to let go of some of that balance, in the short run. So that's pretty much it, in the research. I don't know if there are any questions, any thoughts. I can stop sharing and we can dive into more the interesting part of the session. Sorry, I was talking at you for such a long time. Would love to hear, Parag. I don't know if there's anything in the chat or, I would love to hear.
I've got a few questions myself, actually, from some of this data. It's interesting to see, this is all data from the Center for Creative Leadership. So they put a lot of resources behind it, which is fantastic. So thank you for sharing that. It's interesting that, when I look at the inherent strengths, embracing diversity, empathy, humility, superior execution, strong work ethic, VUCA-friendly, most of those, like, yeah, that's us, no problem. Empathy is one that, when I think of the stereotype, empathy is not one that comes to mind, because often we are perceived as being, unemotional, straight-faced, never reacting, don't give a rat's whatever what's happening at home, got to get your work done regardless, you know what I mean? And so it kind of feels like it conflicts a little bit. What was your take on that?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I think some of the things that you mentioned kind of resonated, right? Like my way and, all of that. But I also feel like there's a whole element of humanness that we also bring to the table. And I think you will just see, let's talk about layoffs. It's happening everywhere right now, right? The way we deal with layoffs in Asia or Europe as compared to how we deal with them in the US, with, kind of a rug pulled off from under your feet and saying, don't come to work from tomorrow. So I feel like, especially when we handle underperformance, I know, at least for myself, and Parag, I would love to hear your thought as well. Like, I feel like we tend to give a long rope. We're a lot more human. We'll try, and there's also like the element of like kind of like mentoring or coaching or guiding people and giving them a chance to succeed, thinking about, okay, their kind of world and what they need from us. So I don't know, I would love to hear from you, like as an Asian leader, what do you think about
That's fascinating. I didn't think about it that way, but that makes a lot of sense. I remember when I was in business school, this one story still sticks in my mind. One of the conglomerates from Korea, it wasn't Samsung or LG, but one of the other ones, the CEO was asked, where they had a Western consultant come in, and they're like, you got this massive payroll, but your margins are this small. You could cut payroll significantly by subcontracting this, that, the other, still have the same margin, but your exposure from a sheer number of employees wouldn't be as high. And the consultant from the West is just like, that's a good thing, because they are focused on the numbers. And the CEO is just like, no, there's a value to providing those jobs. There's a value, there is a social contract, so to speak, of providing sustenance to a population, even though the company may not make that many more dollars, it is worth it. And so when you're explaining that story, that's what comes to my mind. And yeah, you're right. I'd love to hear if anybody else, if you have any comments on that, please feel free to toss it into the chat. But no, that's a fascinating take, especially since you did work in India for quite a long time before coming over here. So, along those lines, as you transitioned, right? You transitioned in the peak of your career, more or less. What was the first thing that stood out? When did you realize, oh wait, this is not, we're not in Kansas anymore? Well, that's a bad example. We're not in Maharashtra anymore. When did you realize? When did it slap you upside the face that, wait, the style's different here?
I think honestly, it happened in the first few months of just like moving here, right? Like my first thought was, okay, I've done this, similar kind of work in Asia, like let me just, go back to the corporate job and similar like work experience. And as I was even interviewing with people, first of all, the culture piece stood out for me. Like, I couldn't understand some things in the interview. I remember I was pregnant with my first baby and I was interviewing, and somebody mentioned to me, like, don't throw the baby out with the bath water. And I was like, oh my God, what does this even mean? And especially for a pregnant woman, it sounded like horrible. So, like culturally, like people would start talking to me about different states and things like that. And I was like, kind of assuming that I know about like the weather or things like that. But I think the biggest difference that I noticed, was like when I was interviewing was lack of confidence in myself. Look, like, oh, I haven't studied in Howard or, those kind of things, coming from a place for the longest time where I thought like, I don't have what maybe is needed to succeed in a totally different culture. But then I realized like a lot of work is pretty same, like human beings are same. There may be a different like methodology or a different way of doing the same things. For example, in Asia, I mean, here it's said that we are not strategic, but at least from the human resources world that I can tell you, like the work that we do is a lot more thought through. But I felt like in corporate America, like, at least in one of the big IT companies that I worked with, they use the term building the plane as we fly it, which basically meant nobody knows what they're doing, just like focus. It was so much bias for action, like do, like just do something, keep yourself busy, be under pressure, stress, create stress, and it was very surprising for me that, it was a lot of like bias for action. Culturally, there was an assumption that everybody's aware of the American culture. Sometimes people would say things in meetings that, people like me wouldn't understand. And then just there were good things as well, right? Like everybody spoke up when they didn't agree with things, whereas, in India or in Asia, you're supposed to just do the nod that we do in India and just agree with what the big guy is saying. So definitely a lot of unlearning and a lot of learning, and then sheer dedication. Like you can't have 5 cups of tea in a day and, be doing work till 8 p.m. Like people are so focused on boundaries. When they are at work, like they focus, they do their work, sure, there's a little bit of networking, whatever. But when you get out, you don't like go and, I mean, people still check their emails, but I feel like in Asia, there's a little bit of lack of that time, kind of, respect for time and finishing work on time and things like that. So, yeah.
Yeah, the first point you mentioned regarding, I didn't go to Harvard or whatnot is it's interesting because, in India, to an extent, your grades determine your career, right? The top grades they are the doctors, right?
Sure.
And then the next is, or I don't know what the tiering is, but doctor, lawyer, engineer, that's the big 3 for all Asians, right? So, and it's more your grades determine your profession, whereas here, not at all, right?
Yeah.
And so to that extent, similarly, at least I found it didn't matter. I went to an Ivy League. It didn't matter. As soon as I started at Proctor day 1, nobody cared. It didn't matter. And I wasn't really, lasered in on, oh, I went to Columbia anyway. That's just not my personality as much. But I remember through my career, 15 years down the road, somebody would notice, oh, on LinkedIn or somewhere else, wow, you went to Columbia? Wow. And I was like, oh yeah, I did. They're like, oh my gosh. And I was like, so, and it really didn't matter. It didn't matter one bit where anybody went. It was really more about, performance. And so that legacy element, it didn't matter so much. That was that's a neat one that you brought up. So I appreciate that. And then I forgot what the other comment I wanted to make is. That's what, I should be taking notes so I remember what I wanted to comment on. But the other piece regarding entrepreneurship, right? The building the plane as you fly it. I remember, one of our trainers is German, and so it's not a Caucasian versus Asian thing. It is very much a country specific thing. It can be a very country specific thing, because he was sharing in Germany, they wouldn't do that. They would be far more like Asians in the fact that you need to plan everything out. You've got to have everything clear and when you're working across boundaries, even within the same company, this can be a major challenge, because when Americans say, oh, let's do this to a German's like, okay, that is set in stone now. That is what we're going to do. Whereas the American next week, oh, well, we decided to pivot. We're going to do a little bit of this instead, right? And that'll drive them insane, which probably drives the Asians insane as well.
That is so interesting that you said that, that next week things change. And this, a large part of my career here was with technology companies. And it was amazing and fascinating to me how sometimes, the thing that I don't miss about my corporate life is, I mean, I miss a lot of good things like the camaraderie and the team, but it's like you sleep and then you don't know what spiraled or what hit the roof while you're sleeping, because you're in a different region, you're working with global companies, and the plan by the time you wake up would have totally changed to something new, and then you're supposed to kind of realign yourself. So my biggest a biggest worry would be okay, what storm am I dealing with today, like waking up to my emails? And that was something that I thought was quite interesting.
Yes.
So we do have some comments in chat, Parag. I don't know if you noticed.
Yeah, I just noticed that. I was just copying and pasting them so I don't lose them. So I love this question from Abhijit. How can we overcome the Asian value of putting family first? You were mentioning this before, just the difference between styles there. How can we overcome that value, putting family first versus taking the instability in personal life to grow career versus via relocating stressful hours and so forth? Actually, I would have thought it was the opposite. I don't know. What's your thoughts on that? So
I don't know, honestly, if we can work on that value, right? I mean, we do put family first. That's just the way we are. I don't know if that's necessarily a bad thing. I feel like one thing that I am very aware of is I grew up with these values, but sometimes, you're so thinly stretched while you're trying to look after your parents and your kids and show up as a professional, that I want to make sure that I do it differently for my kids, right? How I'm raising them and things like that. I don't understand the second part of the question, Parag. Can you clarify taking instability in personal life? I mean, it's a personal choice about taking instability, really. I don't think that necessarily the only way to grow. A lot of times I do a lot of coaching work with women, and there's a constant guilt factor, basically. If you're a mom, as a wife, or as a professional, you're kind of trying to balance it all. And I think the biggest thing that I make them aware of, it's a choice, and you can absolutely make that choice, as long as you're happy with it, to say, okay, I want to focus on my career for the next 5 years while my kids are growing, or I'm in this phase, maybe I don't need to do the crazy hours. Or the other choices, you can still, show up as a professional, do your 100%, but not check your emails. It doesn't mean that your career is going to stall, really, as long as you're kind of doing the work that you're doing in a dedicated way. So I don't know, Abhijit, if that answered your question, in some ways, but I do feel like, this value of putting family first, in some ways, it's also a good thing. I feel it shows up in different avenues and aspects of our life. It could be with team members, it could be as a leader, how do we show up, the whole feeling of camaraderie, community, all that. So I wouldn't necessarily say that, we need to work on that.
I agree. I think actually the challenge here should be more one of how do we communicate those values, because a lot of times we don't share that with our managers.
Yeah.
And instead, if a manager asks us to move somewhere, we'll feel that pressure of needing to satisfy them or needing to say yes, because we like to say yes far more than we like to say no. And then taking that pressure on ourselves instead of actually discussing it and saying, hey, this is a challenge for me right now. I am interested in that promotion, in that relocation. Would it be possible to look at that at this timing when it would be better for my family? Not only that, don't wait until that conversation comes to you. proactively have that conversation with your manager and say, this is where I want to get to. While I was at Procter, this was definitely a challenge that we had of Asian managers, first or second generation, feeling comfortable or understanding that they own their career plan, not the company. So they should be proactively talking with their manager about what they want to do or what they know about that they want to do for the next role, the role after, where they want to get to, versus waiting for the company to select them, because that's not how it works.
I would say that's the humility in some ways, right? We talked about that being a trait, and Parag, you made such a good point. And that's the thing that, I think I struggled for the longest time. At least when I was in Asia, I never asked for a promotion. And I thought my boss was supposed to notice how hard I'm working while I'm hiding under the table, and they're supposed to pick you up and uplift you, which I think is a totally different culture where you're supposed to self-advocate. You're supposed to show what you're doing and things like that. And especially in women, I think that shows up a lot more than even men. The whole self-advocacy, and it kind of changes. If you're a woman, woman of certain ethnicity, I think there's gradations there on how you're kind of self-advocating and asking for what you want.
Yeah, definitely. Actually, on that front, Jenny Tran asks, how does disparity in Asian leadership differ between Asian men and Asian women? And as an Asian woman in leadership, how do you manage expectations from your family, parents, children, and especially yourself?
That's such a great question, Jenny. I feel like you and I need to talk, but I definitely know. I mean, I don't have the data, but I have worked a lot with D&I space, Jenny and the rest of the participants. Women are a lot less represented. For example, I was working with a big telecom company, and their leadership, telecom is very sales and very kind of high paced and all that. And this was in India. And I know at that time, because I was doing a lot of work around gender diversity, overall in the organization, there were only 16% women at that time, which the number felt even lower. It was 6% in leadership teams. So you can imagine, and we did a lot of work, and I know after years from 16%, it went up to 24% or something. And this is 20,000, 25,000 large, organizations. So definitely, I feel like the representation is far less. And I think there are obvious reasons. Post-pandemic, you can see so many women quitting their jobs or, starting businesses, or, many women just stayed at home and things like that. I feel like there's a constant challenge about balancing, right? And the coaching question, in fact, in one of the, focus group discussions, Parag, that we did last time, I asked a few women and I said, where in life are you willing to show up 6 on 10 instead of 9 or 10 on 10, right? This is a kind of a thought-provoking. And a lot of times we say nowhere, as a parent, as a professional, as a wife, as a daughter. So I feel like there's a constant struggle. And I'm not saying I've aced it all, but I think things have really changed for me since I started working on my own. I'm a lot more in control, for example, blocking out the summer in a way that I want to spend quality time with the kids, slowing down, taking a 2-week vacation, sometimes saying that, okay, this is, for example, I have little kids. I don't know about me. I'm sure many women on the call may have kids. So it's a conscious choice to kind of not go all out and just manage what I can do in a good way and show up as a good, and then getting all the extra help. I've stopped feeling guilty about that.
Yeah. Actually, your comment reminds me of something Inder New used to talk about. She'd come home and it was her own mother that would say, okay, you're CEO of Pepsi was, right? So you're CEO of Pepsi outside, but here you're the homemaker. And her own mother would get on her for not having dinner. Which speaks to culturally just how far of a patriarchal society our Asian heritage is coming from. And so that often is our biggest challenge, in my opinion, right? That often is our biggest challenge, is just our own, what we are bringing to what expectations we're bringing. And, the data, the data wise, Asian women by far are the least represented. Women to begin with are less represented, but as that's growing, we've definitely seen an increase over the last 30 years. But even if you dissect from there, our partners at Ascend Leadership do a fantastic job of doing this in their research. Asian women by far are the outlier. If you took Indian men out of the equation, the delta would look even worse. So South Asian women, East Asian men, and then East Asian women are probably the least represented. And so there's probably multiple layers of not just the bamboo and the glass ceiling. I think there's probably a third one in there too. So yeah, so Jenny, to your point, that's what that's what I know at least. So yeah. Jason asks, this is a super interesting question. I have no idea here. So are non-Asian immigrants or non-Asian immigrants, first generation folks, do we know if they are also underrepresented in leadership roles versus Asians, similar to Asians?
I wouldn't know that. I think I'll have to dig in some data. My guess would be, again, it would be a similar pattern where US may be doing slightly better than Europe because we're used to, at least now, getting used to promoting immigrants, whereas for Europe, it's a lot harder. But I wouldn't know that. My guess would be it would be still underrepresented because I've done some work, in the coaching space with Latin communities and things like that. And the struggle is kind of similar in some ways, but I don't know how much, that's kind of showing up. I don't know, Parag, what your take is on that.
I think it's going to be one more of, I think there will be some amount of delta, but I think the bigger delta is cultural. So I think like UK leaders that come over, I would almost say that they might be promoted faster than Americans just because their accent makes them seem smart. For whatever reason, we have this idea anybody with a British accent must be really smart. So they can be at parity with an American, but for whatever reason, we've got this image, right? So I think it actually, I would imagine that it depends more on, Jason, as you mentioned, how close it is to the culture of the US. And so certainly when I think back to leaders that I had at Procter when I was there were plenty of of European leaders who rose up the ranks relatively fast as far as I could see. So yeah. Angela asked this question. I didn't read it through, so I'm just going to read it now.
Sure.
Simmer touched upon Asians adhering more to a hierarchy. Can you expand on that and explain how that's a strength in the workplace? Companies now need to hire younger generation of workers and retain them who might be turned off by an organization that has a strict hierarchy. The tune now is everyone has a voice and each voice is equally important. Very true. So so the hierarchy piece, that wasn't necessarily a positive, right? Wasn't necessarily a strength. It's just one of the attributes that we have, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And Parag, you can chime in as well. I feel like you have some thoughts there.
I think I think this is actually one of the biggest challenges that we have is unlearning some of that. I remember it took me 15 years to not feel awkward about calling my boss by their first name, right? I felt like I had to call them Mr. or Mrs. or whatnot like that. And conversely, my non-Asian wife, it felt really weird when her mom insisted that I call her by her first name. I'm like, no. But I didn't have an alternate word. And she calls my parents, auntie and uncle, because right.
Yeah.
But I felt like I needed to do that at work as well. Is that something that you that you experienced in India different than here, or was it the same as far as addressing leadership?
Yeah, I think I would say definitely hierarchy. In India, they use the word boss a lot, like boss, let's do this, or they'll use, sometimes a kind of a G or something as a respect, right? Shri, G, these are the things that are, bosses are a little bit on the pedestal. They're supposed to know it all and have all the knowledge. And I don't know if this is honestly a strength. I would say there are attributes of this attribute which may be a strength. For example, because there's a hierarchy, in some ways we are better mentors to our team members, right? We
Okay.
are more kind of, okay, let's like solve this together kind of approach, which is like, I think in some ways good thing, because you do need that direction, especially if you're new to the organization, you're a new manager, you have a team. There's so many aspects that you could use some help and guidance from your leader. But I think the flip side to that is, in hierarchy, we don't share like things that we truly, there's a whole passive aggressive thing, right? Like we'll agree and then we'll go and we'll bitch to our best friend and we'll say, oh my God, my boss doesn't know what he's doing. I almost want to like shift to Hindi like at this point, but I'm going to refrain. But really, like, we agree and then we disagree and then we're like not motivated and we're just kind of complying with what the boss is saying. So I don't know if that's really a strength. Right. So
Right.
I think the first thing that I learned when I moved here was like everybody has a voice. And honestly, it was a little bit annoying sometimes, because if I'm trying to run a project, like I had to talk to like 10 people and bring them on board. I couldn't just say like, hey, I've decided this, or the team has decided, let's just go. But in some ways, it was also good, because then the commitment, the shared commitment that you got from the group, because you truly took their point of view, you changed your plan, was a lot higher than just, you figuring out everything. And I think the biggest learning for me was like, I'm not supposed to figure it out all alone. Like I have a team that I can depend on, and I can like use those resources. But also when I was interviewing, I remember with one of the organizations, it was very interesting that I was interviewing, and I, how you interview with the manager, boss's boss, and like head of the group. And it was very interesting. Again, a big technology company, they were paying a lot of money, and I didn't end up taking that job because everybody told me, like, I want to just hire you and get out of the picture. So everybody was telling me like, and that was like kind of like a wake up call for me, because in Asia, that's not how it works. Like the boss has to be equally involved. But I feel like in America, it was like, I have hired you so that I don't have to think about these things and be involved. So I think there are pros and cons, but generally I feel like speaking up, being assertive, getting everybody's opinion, sharing more voices, these are good things, because these lead to innovation. These lead to diversity, and that's how our customer base is. So I would definitely tune into this trait a little bit more.
Interesting. Yeah, that's fascinating insights. I really appreciate you sharing that. I wonder, do you have so Amanda Slaughter asks a question regarding Indigenous populations, and I have to admit, I haven't paid all that much attention when I've looked at the data. As a DEI professional, do you recall any data being shared specifically about Indigenous populations here in the States versus other populations, regarding how their strengths are perceived or what their progression is and so forth? And if you don't, then you don't. But I'm just curious if you recall any data being seen.
I think the data that I shared here today was all of like Indians, the representation of Indian leaders in American companies.
Okay.
So that data said that, the US only has 8%, of Asian leaders, half of which are kind of Indians. And then Europe has 2%, out of and then Europe owns 61 out of the 200 like top companies, and all of them are Indians. Whereas the Asian companies have the majority of it. So that data was, of Indian leaders, and it seems like the representation is not that great at all.
Okay. Yeah. I don't recall it showing up in the numbers either. So yeah, I'm going to keep an eye out for it though. Amanda, thank you for pointing that out, and see, does that even show up on the chart? Is it even being tracked, and so forth? So, Jenny asks another great question here regarding, generation, first generation versus second generation and so forth, and how attributes are being changed. So she asks, do either of us see these attributes, these typical Asian attributes changing, with younger generations as they unlearn certain behaviors or overcome generational trauma of our parents and grandparents? What trends do you see in the evolution over time as you deal with clients or just in your own personal experience?
Yeah, I think definitely, there's a lot of changes that are coming by. I mean, I can talk about clients as well, but just like talking about kids, I feel like generally I have seen like even the difference between my daughter, like, you know, if I'm having a conversation with her and I'm like, she was telling me the other day, like, hey, like I don't want to use toothpaste to brush my teeth, for example. And I'm like, okay, now the Indian parent in me would have said, like, you have to use it, go, like do it, and that's it. Like there's no, because I said so. But I think I've learned over a period of time, like curiosity, which also came, as, and then asking her, like, why don't you want to use the toothpaste? Like, what's going on? And then she was like, I don't like this brand and I like that brand more and blah, blah, blah. So I feel like there's a lot of like change in general, like even the whole focus of like always on our parents. You can see the more nuclear family setups, like whether it leave like US, like even in India, I think there's a lot more change that's coming across where people are more individualistic, they're far more driven, especially they're raising their kids very differently. Even the generation that we have, and Parag, you can talk more because you would have like cousins, and I see a world like difference, right? Like even the fact that my niece, wanted to take a year off and figure out what she wants to do next,
Absolutely.
And the whole family was like you said, there were three options, of like doctor, engineers, and we had no mentors, and nobody to tell us like what other alternate career options could be. So there are many things, at least, that I'm seeing changing, for the second generation, first generation. I don't know, Parag, what your experience has been.
No, spot on. I think the ones that I think that'll change fastest are actually the kids of the Asian leaders, the Asian professionals who actually make it higher up, because they're the ones who realize, hey, these soft skills are important. You need to, and they're the ones who are less likely to insist that their kids bring home 100% and realize that, hey, all these other skills are super important. And the more we do these types of trainings and awareness building around why this stuff is important and how to get to leadership roles, and we more normalize it within our community, then we as parents as well will be able to adjust. I think there is inherently, the more we and our next generations grow up here, that's absolutely true. There's also the factor of multiracial, right? I mean, the number of kids, the number of new hires who joined P&G as I left versus when I started that were multiracial, like night and day difference. Probably. I mean, it felt like 35-50% nearly were multiracial, and that inherently means that there is a higher level of understanding that culture plays a part in behavior, a very large part in behavior. So, Jenny, I don't think it'll take very long. I don't think it'll take very long at all. And what I see is that the larger Asian challenges tend to stick with the first generation. So even within our SASE collegiate chapters, a lot of the folks who are really drawn to it more so are actually the first generation folks, more so than the second generation, and that says something. And immigration patterns still can still point to Asians continuing to be the highest percentage of immigrants to the US. So we will continue to have this challenge for our newer generations. And so I think it's also incumbent on us as an Asian ERG population to reach out to those folks proactively and help them so that they and the positive is that first generation folks are more likely to realize there's a gap here because right, Simmer, this firsthand, you're going to realize that there's a gap here like pretty fast. So the positive is that they will realize, and they'll be open to the idea of, okay, help me help me understand. But I think the Asian ERG work would be very well spent if we can put in proactive mechanisms to reach out to those first generation folks and cater to them, because they are going to be the ones that are probably have the higher challenges. So we are getting really close to time here. Let's take one more from Gary. How can we influence in company culture to promote Asians in senior leadership roles across all industries? What have you seen to be effective tactics from your work?
Yeah, I feel like some things that before the companies promote us, like we need to promote ourselves. Right? A lot of times there's so many good things that we bring to the table, and we talk so much of that about, right? So advocating for ourselves, really strongly owning who we are, right? A lot of times we feel like as people of different like origin, we are thinking differently. And I feel like diversity is a good thing. So definitely there's a lot more, we have a seat on the table, really. It's just about how do we self-advocate? How do we realize, what our strengths are, where we're not doing so well? For example, we talked about hierarchy, we talked about speaking up, we talked about influencing, strategic thinking, and building those kind of things. I feel like my biggest advice to, organizations is like, if you do not value your talent, your key talent, whether they're immigrants, people of color, and you don't invest in them and you help them grow. And we can talk about, it's a very short time to answer this question, because the needs of Asian talent in terms of development are slightly different, because you need to look at things from their lens, right? We always talk about like equality versus equity, right? Giving everybody the same podium to stand on doesn't help, whereas somebody who's coming from a different cultural background will need a little bit more help. So I think coming back to the point, really, with organizations, I tell them, if you don't retain your talent of color, somebody else is going to take them and kind of, take them away from you, which in the long run is a price that the organizations will need to pay. So I would say self-advocacy, really talking about approaching things from curiosity, and sometimes educating people, when they make assumptions about you, making sure you ask for the resources that you need for your own development, and owning that seat on the table. These are the 3-4 things that come to my mind for really Asians to be in bigger positions in global
Yeah.
roles.
No, that's great. That's great. That's great input. I think the only thing that I would, add is, from what I've seen, it is absolutely critical to have the infrastructure within the organization to support that. So there is an individual piece here, but there's an organizational piece as well. In my belief, the Asian ERGs are critical in that, in that process. And the best companies have a robust DEI HR structure that partners with the Asian ERGs, which is also why we approach now I'm just advocating for SASE. Let me stop that. But that's why we designed this way. Okay, we're at time. Megan, could you toss up the poll real quick? And I'd like to also just share, what's coming up. So this feedback survey, there are 3 quick questions. Be sure to scroll down and answer all 3 and then hit send. This helps us know how we're doing. Let me get that out of the way. Our next webinar is coming up on Wednesday. Oh, there it is. Wednesday, August 23rd, from 4 o'clock to 5 p.m. Eastern, with Amy Yip, a fireside chat on authentic connections. She's written a wonderful book called Unfinished Business. Actually, I can't say wonderful yet because I haven't read it. I pre-ordered it, but the conversations I've had with Amy have been fantastic. Generational trauma, as somebody mentioned in a question, is actually a lot of what she tackles, and so we're going to have a great conversation about this. You can follow us, see what's coming up on saseconnect.org/webinar. That's where you should be able to register for Amy's webinar as well. Actually, I need to double check that. Our Top Gun Leadership Academy, it is actually sold out, so we've already started that. But the next big thing is our national convention and STEM career fair. You can go to our website, saseconnect.org, or convention.saseconnect.org, and learn more about it. We are in the throes of planning for it, and we've got a fantastic lineup coming up. So I'm super excited about this convention, and I really hope to see all of you there. If your Asian ERG is not connected to us, please reach out, pro@saseconnect.org. There is no cost. There is no membership fee for companies or individuals. We very much operate off of a registration model so that we can focus on delivering the best value to Asian professionals and ERGs versus sponsorship dollars. Okay, so with that, hey, thank you so much for being here, and we are good to go, and we hope to see you in another month. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Parag.